you think if we sue for peace in May 1940, that's it, we're out of the war?
And if we show any sense that we're going to come back into the war, Hitler will come at us with full power.
In the long term, a peace with Germany in 1940 would have been a disaster for Britain and for the world.
So if Britain sues for peace in 1940, Barbarossa succeeds?
I think so.
If it takes place later. I have to stress, I'm not saying that Barbarossa doesn't happen.
You're saying later, yeah.
Stalin was inherently suspicious of absolutely everybody, but it's ironic that the one person he trusted was Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
Does that lead to a Nazi victory in World War II?
Well, how do you define victory? As Nigel said earlier...
Victory in Europe?
Well, it certainly leads to victory and domination of Europe.
It's the end of May 1940 and a monumental decision looms large over Britain and Western Europe. Over the previous 3 weeks, the German Blitzkrieg campaign began steaming through Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands and France. Neville Chamberlain had resigned as Prime Minister and been replaced by Winston Churchill. And British forces were beginning their evacuation from Dunkirk. All the while, back in the UK, the new war cabinet was in crisis, deciding whether Britain would fight on or seriously consider peace terms with Adolf Hitler. Of course, it was the former, and Churchill's legendary "We shall fight on the beaches" speech on the 4th of June cemented that position. Yet what if the unthinkable alternative was chosen and Britain had come to terms less than a year into the war? I'm James Hansen and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode we focus on a different military campaign or tide of history, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. This episode is sponsored by Visit Malta. Right in the heart of the Mediterranean, Malta is a blend of history, culture, nature and hospitality. To find out how you can explore more wonder and learn about Malta's rich history and culture, head to visitmalta.com. Today, we're discussing what could have been if the British government had come to terms with Nazi Germany in 1940. And there were certainly those who were keen on the idea, but how close was it really to becoming a reality? Well, that's a question for our experts, and joining me today, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and returning to the channel is the historian and journalist Nigel Jones. Welcome to you both. We have before us our big map of continental Europe as it would have been around about 1940 at the time when this discussion would have been happening in London about what to do regarding the war. Dr. Chris Parry, always a pleasure to have you with me. Just set the scene. How bad are things for Britain in May of 1940?
Well, it depends, of course, which end of May you're looking at. Certainly up to the defeat of France. We're trying to see what the chess pieces are doing on the board. The Germans have gone through Netherlands and Belgium. France looks like it's going to fall. And of course, what it preceded that was the German invasion of Denmark and also Norway as well. And that significantly alters the strategic geometry once that happens. You then get a situation, of course, where after the fall of Norway, there's a move against Chamberlain within the Conservative Party. And there's not a lot of faith left in amongst the Labour Party either. And so you get a situation where Churchill becomes Prime Minister. France, of course, falls virtually as soon as he takes office. And a decision has to be made at that point whether to withdraw the British Expeditionary Force, which of course is on the continent. That leads to Dunkirk afterwards, and whether Britain needs to withdraw its remaining fighter squadrons that are also, and bomber squadrons that are also in France. And a decision, of course, is made under Dowding's recommendation that no more fighters are sent to France. And it looks like Britain is digging in for holding out against Hitler. But if you look at the discussions at the time, look at the Whip's records, for example, from the political parties. There's considerable discussion about whether Britain needs to come to terms at this point. Without France in the war, it means, of course, we've got one single country dominating Europe. The balance of power has gone, and of course, the Germans have reached the Channel coast opposite. So, fairly desperate situation. Will the bulk of the army be taken off the beach, as it subsequently was at Dunkirk? Is it going to be surrounded? Is it going to be captured? All the equipment's going to be left, that's for sure. And essentially the politicians have to make a choice. My view is, with Churchill there was no way we were going to surrender. We were always going to fight, because Churchill's whole career, of course, throughout the 1930s was based on defiance of Nazism, as he called it, and also defiance of an expanding Germany and Italy, of course. You mustn't forget, Italy jumps in just at the last moment once France is seen to be defeated. And so we've got to take into account Italy's agenda here, as well as Germany's at this point, and so do our politicians.
And we'll come on to Italy in due course, because there are those who say, well, had Britain sued for peace, it may well have been Mussolini who'd play a key role in brokering that peace. Nigel, always a pleasure to have you with us. Welcome back to History Undone. Chris makes a very good point there about the role of Churchill and how influential he was in Britain fighting on, but it was not inevitable that he would have succeeded Chamberlain. There was a real, almost unofficial contest.
By no means. I mean, I think in the political world, most people expected Edward Wood, Earl of Halifax, an aristocrat. He had several disadvantages. He couldn't sit in the House of Commons, and he knew that Churchill, with his dynamic personality and his military experience, would dominate any war cabinet that he sat in. So he would be effectively a hollow prime minister with Churchill constantly at his shoulder, bullying him, cajoling him. So he didn't really want to become prime minister. But had anything happened to Churchill, and this is one of the few moments in history when history really did hang on the single life of a 65-year-old politician, Winston Churchill. If anything had happened to him, he'd been being shot down on one of his visits to France to try and shore up the failing French. Halifax would definitely have become Prime Minister and would definitely, in my view, have sued for peace.
Yeah, so tell us a bit more about what Halifax's position was at the time.
Halifax was Chamberlain, the previous Prime Minister's right-hand man in his appeasement policy. He had also been to Germany, he'd met Hitler, he'd met Goering, he knew what the Nazis were like, but he was an appeaser, an arch-appeaser. He was an aristocrat. He did not have Churchill's common touch or his eloquence. So Churchill was able to inject the British public with a will to win purely because of his speeches, his radio speeches. We shall fight them on the beaches, we shall never surrender, darkest hour. We all know those phrases, which epitomise Britain's determination to go on fighting after the fall of France. Halifax wasn't like that at all. He was an aristocrat, not much contact with the common man or woman, and he would have been a drag on Churchill's efforts to prolong the war, I think. And that's why Churchill, in actual fact, Churchill, of course, survived and became Prime Minister. He got rid of Halifax as soon as possible by making him ambassador to the US, getting him out of the country. Like he got rid of another appeaser, so Samuel Hall, by making him ambassador to Spain. But Halifax was in line. He would have become Prime Minister if Churchill had not been there.
And Chris, even once Churchill becomes Prime Minister, that is not the end of the debate within the War Cabinet. There are still conversations ongoing as May drags on. Do we need to explore terms?
Yeah, and in fact, one thing we don't consider is that Chamberlain is still there.
Yes.
You know, he obviously gets ill pretty soon afterwards and is out of the scene, but he's still hovering around.
He was
the
Lord President of the Council, I think, and Tory leader still, technically,
Yeah. So he's still in the background, and people are still looking to him to saying, well, what do you think? And we mustn't forget the long shadow that is cast on this generation by the First World War.
Yeah.
Same was true in France. People were very reluctant to go to war and repeat what had happened. And so that really sort of fed the appeasement policy of a lot of these people, but also emotionally it affected them when they were making decisions. What is key, I think, is the support of the Labour Party, oddly enough, who are violently anti-Nazi. They are absolutely explicit that they will support Churchill. They don't want to work for Halifax. They certainly don't want to work for Chamberlain. And I think, to be perfectly fair to the Labour Party, they ideologically are saying we must oppose fascism. We must oppose what is going on in Germany and this expansionism in Europe. And Attlee and the rest of them are on record as saying that all the way through the late 30s. So I think it's important that it is Churchill, but he's getting a lot of support from the Labour Party, and he knows that. So he's able to use that to actually sort of lever his own party to say, look, we need to go on the front foot here.
And he manoeuvres sort of the wider cabinet against the War Cabinet because he knows he has more support in the wider cabinet.
Absolutely. And as Nigel hinted, he hand selects the people he wants in the War Cabinet. It's a very small group. And of course, he co-opts people experts who can actually help in this regard. And in some ways, he's making it up as he goes along. And so you need that central thread of resistance to actually prevail. Meanwhile, of course, the Germans are starting to say, well, we'll help you see reason. We've got no desire to demolish the British Empire. We just need a free hand in Europe. And you've got Ribbentrop, you've got Goebbels, all saying we don't want to continue the war. So it's sapping away at morale and things like that, and offering this sort of devil's bargain that if you play with us, play ball with us, then we're not going to invade, even though we're preparing for it, and we're telling you we're preparing for it.
Yes, and should we believe the Germans in that?
At all.
Yeah, hold that thought, because we'll come back to what terms may have looked like had Britain sued for peace. Nigel, we talk sometimes about this great man of history theory. In this case, do you think it applies? Do you think had it not been for Winston Churchill in May of 1940, Britain would have sued for peace?
I do. I absolutely do. Under Halifax, it would have done. And there was a huge, as Chris has just said, there was a huge revulsion against war. The Great War, the First World War, had only ended 20 years before. Many, almost 1 million Britons and Commonwealth men had died in that war. And it cast a huge shadow across the whole of the interwar period. So Churchill was unusual, I think. He was a warrior. He was by nature and by training and by experience, he was a man of war. Whereas Chamberlain and Halifax were men of peace. Neither of them had had any military experience. Neither of them had been in the First World War. And they were by nature and by their own life's experience peacemakers. And Churchill knew this. And I think another point worth making, as Chris rightly said, the Labour Party stood behind Churchill, but the Tory party was very much still against Churchill, distrustful of Churchill. Don't forget, Churchill's record up to the war had been one of almost unrelieved political failure. He had failed over Gallipoli, the big black mark against him, which had been his baby in the First World War. He had failed as Chancellor of the Exchequer. He had earned the hatred of the working class through his tough measures against strikers in Wales and in the general strike in 1926. He'd failed again in the appeasement crisis when he'd backed up Edward VIII in his ridiculous...
the abdication crisis,
So, indeed, Churchill was not beloved by his own Tory party. And it was his eloquence and his strength of character which carried the day, and his absolute determination to fight on whatever the odds. And the odds were huge. Even Churchill did not see a strategy clear how Britain was going to carry on fighting the war unless it got America into the war.
And I think what's important is he's seen as an opportunist. And you get hints of this today, that Churchill basically is banging the war drums because it's in his interests. He has a vested interest politically in actually being identified with the war. And how many times have we heard this, that wars are continued because politicians need it?
Yes.
You're hearing this about Israel now and Netanyahu. And so there was a whiff of that in relation to Churchill as well. He needs the war. He's got no basis for continuing politically. As Nigel says, his record up to that point didn't suggest that he was going to be a successful leader.
So, Chris, does Churchill really have a strategy at this point, or is it simply to live to fight another day?
No, I think essentially Britain and France have lost the initiative in this war. The Germans have got the initiative, and we're reacting. We're saying, look, what can we do to actually reconstitute the Royal Air Force ahead of a possible attack? The fleet's in being, of course. The fleet is out there dominating the seas. Next to Japan, it's probably the most powerful navy in the Atlantic and the Pacific at that point, even more than the Americans are. And so we've got some things going for us. So he's thinking, OK, we've got to preserve the home islands, but Churchill's also thinking about the empire. I think that's the key thing that actually sort of rings through in some of the things he says at this point. He's not just thinking about the home islands, he's thinking about the empire. Yes. And that's because that's the fallback position. If we have a problem here in the home islands, we're going to Canada, and so is the fleet. And so what Churchill does think is in global terms, not just in regional terms. He's beginning to think, how can we bring the resources of the empire in to help? How can we actually bring the Americans in?
Yeah.
Yes.
He's thinking very early about things like that. But more than anything, they need to do an audit of capability. They don't really know how capable they are after the withdrawal from France. There's no question about that. The army has no equipment. The RAF desperately needs re-engineering before it takes on the Luftwaffe, if it has to do that. And of course, as I said, the propaganda from Germany right now is, look, you've either got a choice of us coming to get you, just like what we've got France, or we can have an easier relationship, because that's what we want.
Well, let's pick up on that. Nigel, make the case to me why Britain should have considered suing for peace in 1940. Imagine you are Lord Halifax. What is the argument for it?
The argument for it is that Hitler would have left the British Empire, and Britain itself, of course, in being, would not have conquered France and treated it as a vassal state. Hitler admired the British... OK. Hitler admired the British Empire. He obsessively saw films about British India and couldn't understand how Britain was able to hold India down against what he would think was a hostile population with just a few thousand troops and a few civil servants. And his interest, Hitler's interest, was in the European continent, the European land mass. So he would have left Britain essentially running the empire with a free hand. He would have left the fleet in being, and this is how Halifax would have seen it, and our vital interests would have been protected. We would not have been a conquered, subverted nation like France was. So from that point of view, from the appeasers' point of view, especially considering we'd been summarily defeated in France, peace with Hitler looked an attractive proposition.
And there is a logic to that, Chris. As much as we may look back now with hindsight and go, well, of course it was right that we fought on, you can see the argument.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But I think we've got to look at the other end of the telescope as well. There was an interesting conversation between the American Undersecretary of State under Cordell Hull. His name was Sumner Welles, and he spoke to Hitler in 1940. And he said, well, what are your terms for peace? And he said, well, for us to have peace, what I want is I want to be able to dominate the continent of Europe, as Nigel said. I particularly don't want interference in Scandinavia and in the Balkans. I want Gibraltar, Malta and the Mediterranean basically demilitarised as far as the Brits are concerned. I want closer integration of the economy of the United Kingdom with Germany. I'd like to get rid of all the Jewish financiers. Early hint there, of course, of what's to come. And also, I am going to develop bases in Norway and France. Now, what's really interesting is Trondheim, which was going to be a German colony, basically, in Norway, a German city, which would be a major fleet base. Now, the real problem for Germany up to this point, in terms of its ambitions, was they always were saying, we want places in the sun. They'd had their colonies taken away during at the end of World War I. And the German Navy's got a huge plan for taking over lots of British colonies, isolating them and actually dominating their trade. And this is hiding in the background. And the Germans still have a plan, basically based on air and also their navy, to take on the United States at some stage. It's in Hitler's second book in 1928. He says we're going to have to deal with the United States. And even at this stage, you see the Germans saying, we're going to radically alter the geometry here. And if you build air and land bases here, you effectively isolate Britain anyway. So you can dominate the trade. You can say, we want your merchant marine to serve our purposes. We also are going to project these very large battleships that we've got planned, 56,000 tons, which never materialised, of course, but they did in Japan. There's the Yamato class that were going to go out and dominate the seas. So the German plan to roll forward beyond Europe must isolate Britain. And I don't know whether Nigel agrees with this. I think they would have imposed a Carthaginian peace on Britain in terms of the amount of armed forces you can have.
Interesting. Nigel, do you want to come in?
I just I don't think that Hitler was interested in fighting Britain. I think he saw Britain in the Nazi racist racial terms as a kindred Aryan Nordic people. And as I said before, he admired the way that the British administered the empire. So I don't think it would have been quite such a harsh piece as Chris envisages.
I think just in terms of the armed forces, there are echoes of saying, look, they did this to us at the end of the First World War.
It's payback time.
Yeah, so you know, the whole issue of the Scapa Flow, the internment of the German High Seas Fleet and all that sort of thing, there are echoes of that. It's particularly from the Navy. The Navy is pretty coercive about Britain, of course, because it's a major naval power. But there's this, let's get out into the Atlantic, let's push forward, you know, against the Americans, because they're going to be our next problem. And so there's a bit of that. And the one thing you see in all German literature strategically is how they are enclosed by having these islands here, which keeps their navy from deploying. That goes away once you've got France and you've got Norway. And the temptation, as I said, to integrate and isolate those islands actually within the continental system is going to be too great. And we all know you can't trust Hitler. Whatever he says, once he's weakened you, he will take the opportunity later to dominate you if he can.
And something I'm sure we'll come on to in due course is even if Britain had sued for peace, would Hitler have respected those terms as the years drag on? Nigel, we've talked about how there was a case for Britain to sue for peace in May 1940. From the German perspective, if you're in Berlin, presumably that is your ideal scenario. Even though there's this looming threat of Operation Sea Lion, Germany invading the British Isles, realistically, they don't want to do that, do they? They'd far rather sue for peace.
Absolutely, they would. Hitler's ultimate goal, as we all know, was to turn the might of Germany against Russia, against communist Russia. And I think we should really talk about how, if peace had been made between Britain and Germany in 1940, how the rest of the war would have panned out. Would Barbarossa have taken place in June 41? Would the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor? And if they did attack Pearl Harbor, would Germany have declared war on the United States as that happened? I mean, let's speculate about what would have happened. I think Hitler would have attacked Russia at that time, and Russia might well have fallen, because one particular reason why the Soviets were able to hold out against Hitler was that they were receiving massive supplies of kit from the United States and from Britain, of course, to continue the war. So there's a good case to be made that Barbarossa would have taken place and Hitler would have won, and they would have been in Moscow.
Well, we will come back to that. Chris, in reality, how close did it actually come to happening?
I don't think so. With Churchill in place, it's not going to happen. Once Churchill, as Nigel says, survives, he starts to assert himself, he establishes his position, he's got his war cabinet in place, and frankly, the country is mobilised.
Yes.
In both conceptual and in sort of propaganda terms as well. And once production starts picking up with aircraft and all the other things start taking place, in some ways it's easier to carry on than it is to actually give up. Just coming back to the issue of what would have happened had Britain come to terms, my sense is that what the Germans would have done is consolidated their economic reach over Europe. The biggest problem the Germans always had throughout the war was access to oil.
Yes.
So I suspect before taking on the Soviet Union, they would have secured their oil supplies and said, look, we've got to mobilise, we've got to repair again because we've had a war in the West. The Luftwaffe, all our armoured forces have got to be revived. And I think there would have been a serious period of consolidation here to actually bring together this new economic and political union that the Germans have got. They'd have also built up, I think, their navy, as I hinted earlier, lots more U-boats to go out into the Atlantic. I think a lot of surface ships, big battleships, cruisers to go out, as I said, to get this place in the sun that they want. And they'll also want to attract more allies as well, I think, before they take on the Soviet Union. They're talking to Japan, of course, at this time. And the one ally we've forgotten, of course, is Italy.
Yes. But let's touch on Italy, because, of course, they haven't officially entered the war at this point. Not yet.
After the fall of France.
After the fall of France. And so Mussolini was often touted as a potential broker of any peace deal.
Yes, as he had been at Munich.
Indeed. And there is even a suggestion, is there not, Nigel, that potentially Britain would have to cede either Gibraltar or maybe Malta or even Egypt to the Italians?
Absolutely, of course. Mussolini referred to the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, our sea. And he wanted, there's no doubt about it whatsoever, he wanted the British colonies in North Africa, i.e. Egypt. He wanted Gibraltar, of course. He wanted Malta, at that time a British-ruled island. He wanted all these. He wanted to lessen Britain's influence in Greece. So he wanted to make the Mediterranean our sea. And as the junior partner in the alliance with Nazi Germany, he would have got his way.
I mean, there's a lot of admiration for Mussolini personally from Hitler as being, if you like, the original fascist.
Yes.
I mean, the real fascist in some ways. And the idea of recreating the Roman Empire here actually suits the Germans because they're happy here and projecting against Russia. I think the key thing is, if you see Germany dominating the rest of Europe, what are you thinking if you're Stalin? Do I actually wait for that attack? Or do I start thinking, actually, I might actually have to preempt this at some stage? So I think there's a two-horse race going on here to see whether Germany attacks Russia, the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union starts to think, we need to gear up and attack Germany here. And at that point, you've got a situation very much where the other powers, Japan, United States, probably get a vote as well in this, because at this point, what's really interesting is Japan is not thinking about expansion into the Pacific. It's thinking about dealing with China, and it's thinking about actually having a war in the East with the Soviet Union. And there's a constant sort of debate between Germany and Japan at this point as to what they should do. And the Germans want them to attack, obviously, the colonial powers in the Pacific, because it distracts Britain from what's going on in Europe. And of course, the Dutch have been overrun by the Germans. And of course, the French colonies, of course, are being left isolated as well. So you've got all sorts of interplay going on here. And I just wonder if the Soviet Union does sit on its heels and say, oh, yeah, we'll just carry on with the pact we've got. We'll just let them build up their economic and political power, and we'll see what happens. I don't think so. I think Stalin, being the character he is, gets very, very worried about what's happening, and perhaps they mobilise.
I think Stalin was inherently suspicious of absolutely everybody, but it's ironic that the one person he trusted was Adolf Hitler, the one person he shouldn't have trusted. But I think in terms of the Far East, I think one thing that would have happened had Britain made peace with Germany is that Japan would have muscled in and dismantled the British Empire in the Far East.
Well, that's a very interesting point, yeah.
And all the countries that were conquered by force of arms by Japan, all the colonies, all the British possessions would have fallen by treaty. They would have insisted, the Japanese, to Hitler, that the British Empire in the Far East was dismantled, including India, I believe.
Nigel, just on that, Hitler talks all the time about, essentially, we're allies with the Japanese right now, but we don't want them taking over the European colonies. He talks all the time about the yellow peril.
Yes.
And he talks about the fact that we need them right now, but actually we really don't want them dominating that. And part of Hitler's point about retaining the empire is that the Japanese don't get a foothold into the British Empire and things like that.
But I think the Japanese would have insisted on that. I think it's likely that they would have definitely wanted that. Whether Hitler would have resisted them on the racial grounds that you describe, that was the one bugbear in Germany's alliance with Japan, was the Nazi racist philosophy that they regarded the Japanese as inferior people, which of course was rather proved to be.
As did the Americans initially, of course.
Indeed.
And we will come back to the long-term consequences of had the decision played out differently in May 1940 in just a moment. That is the real history of what the discussions were in Britain around that time. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, it's time to ask ourselves some really big long-term questions now. Had Britain sued for peace in 1940, what would the consequences be? Now, Chris, to start with you, I suppose the immediate thing is, what does it mean for the war in Europe? the Nazi regime strengthened immediately.
Absolutely. And I also think you'd have had the whole of France taken over by Germany. They would not have had a Vichy government in place. They'd have been very keen with the Italians to dominate North Africa. You see an early plan by the German Navy to say, well, we'd actually like some bases here in North Africa, so we can project into the Atlantic. We're certainly not having the Brits retain Gibraltar, Malta. And one thing we didn't mention earlier, they wanted to internationalise the Suez Canal. And say it's got to be free movement for everybody. We're not having the Brits being able to say who can go through the Suez Canal or not. So you can see Britain's ability to control the sea lanes and also its routes to its empire are going to be curtailed severely by any sort of attempt to sort of come to terms. And the Germans had very clear plans, as I said earlier, to actually take over the trade to those colonies and basically build up their places in the sun. And I think it's always been very short-sighted thinking that the agenda was always about just Britain. I mean, what's ironic, of course, is that Barbarossa, Hitler says, Barbarossa is launched in order to bring Britain to terms.
Yes.
Because if you knock out Russia, the Soviet Union, then Britain will give up. And of course, the parallel diplomacy, the Atlantic Charter, all that, they don't know what's going on in relation to what's going on with America at the time. But we mustn't forget that the initial aim, and I do think the Germans would have had a strategic pause of some significance before they wanted to take on Russia. And as I hinted earlier again, I think Russia would have gone, even at that point, even given Stalin's gullibility with regard to Hitler, there's something going on here we need to be interested in. And particularly because the Germans want to dominate the Balkans.
So you still think Barbarossa happens? Because if we follow your argument that ultimately Barbarossa was at least in part motivated by a desire to knock Britain out of the war, well, if Britain is already effectively out of the war, and if you've got access to natural resources maybe down into the Persian Gulf...
Well, you've got Romania.
Yeah, exactly.
The oil fields here. OK, you might want to tempt Turkey into some sort of arrangement with you. You've still got to trade with Russia. I mean, you can continue the Ribbentrop-Molotov.
Exactly. So maybe Barbarossa doesn't get launched.
Well, that's my sense, Nigel, is that actually doesn't need to happen at that point. And as long as they can consolidate in the general government and all the other Lebensraum areas they've got here, it's only when you perceive actually that you need to deal with the Soviet Union because they're becoming that threat. Remember, hidden behind all the propaganda of Barbarossa is this idea that they were going to attack us. We know they were building up for it. And I give some credibility to that. I think the Russians at that point were getting windy. And certainly after the fall of France, there are enough hints. And of course, the Soviets have actually got spies who can actually tell them this. Not here.
But they were being ignored, Chris. That's the point.
No,
Stalin was ignoring all the warnings.
Yeah.
He got hundreds of warnings that Barbarossa was about to happen.
And he purged his army.
He did, and he refused to listen to them. And anyone, in fact, who brought him the bad news was in danger of losing their heads. He really did. And I think you're underestimating. You are giving too much credence to Hitler as a strategic thinker and not enough to his ideological manias, his absolute racist mania to destroy communism, to destroy Judeo-Marxism.
I agree with that. All I'm saying is there's a strategic pause before Barbarossa happens.
Right.
That window, I think, gives the Soviet Union a chance to say there's something going on here that we don't like. And it would have been impossible to conceal a massive build-up in the way that Barbarossa was concealed. Again, you're right. There was evidence that Barbarossa was on the ground, but given the huge number of troops that wouldn't have been necessary in the West at this point, very difficult. And you're seeing an economic build-up. So I do wonder. I'm not saying it would be any different because the Russians are in a terrible state in terms of military preparedness.
But you think it maybe happens later?
I think it happens later, maybe even a year later.
That's possible.
That's the point. I think the amount of consolidation required here is huge if you're going to actually make this a permanent 1,000-year Reich.
I want to come on to the US and Japan and the Pacific in a moment, but on Britain and the British Empire, one of the big arguments, Nigel, for suing for peace was to protect our colonies, and yet Is that true? Would they have been protected?
No, I think one thing that we can all agree on is however it had panned out, whether the war had gone on as it actually did in reality, or whether we'd made peace in 1940, the British Empire as it was doomed. Because as it actually happened, America helped win the war, was with the Soviet Union the primary power responsible for beating Nazi Germany, and the Americans didn't like the British Empire one bit. Roosevelt was quite openly contemptuous of the British Empire, and he made very clear that in the post-war order, colonies and the British and French empires would have no peace. So we would have lost the empire. We did lose the empire then. We would have lost it had we made peace with Nazi Germany for the reasons that we've all alluded to, that other powers wanted to take bites out of the British Empire, and Hitler wouldn't have gone to the war to protect the British Empire, even though he admired it.
And who would be running Britain? I mean, presumably under this scenario, Churchill would have resigned or not become Prime Minister at all, so therefore maybe you get a Halifax, you get someone else. There was even talk at one point of Lloyd George coming back. Who would be running Britain?
There was talk of Lloyd George, of course. He was, by then, very elderly, the man who, in many respects, won the Great War. And he was also very much a defeatist. He'd gone to visit Hitler before the war, and he, in some ways, admired Hitler. And he was a physical coward. He was scared and took shelter during the Blitz. So he wouldn't have been a convincing war leader in the Second World War as he had been in the First World War. No, I think, as I said at the beginning, that Halifax would have been the Prime Minister. The Tory party would have still been the dominant force in the House of Commons and would have followed Halifax in making peace with Germany. That would have been agreed. The Labour Party wouldn't have wanted it, but they would have had to swallow it.
There's another scenario, of course, that comes out of this, is that there probably would have been a general election. You're not at war.
If Britain's not at war, you can hold an election,
you can have a general election. So I suspect that the balance of forces in Britain at that point would have tended towards the Labour Party, oddly enough.
And maybe they come in and declare war after all.
What happens in 1945? And I think the crisis would have brought forward a desire for unity, which only could have been really brought in, midwifed, if you like, by a general election. I don't think, I agree with Nigel. I mean, Halifax would have been weak if Chamberlain had come back, again, weak, defeated, as well as being defeatist. And I think, knowing the tenor of the British people in those circumstances, we probably would have had a general election.
And that may have resulted in a Labour government that then takes a more hawkish approach and does declare war again?
No, we're not in a position to do that. I think, if we've detuned our military, either because we've been coerced to do so by Germany, or indeed there are other things going on that we need to deal with, we are not in a great position to do anything about it. I mean, I think the issue, if we come to terms, is there's absolutely no chance at all of doing anything about this at all, even if America decides it wants to enter the war. Without Britain being involved in this, it's not happening. And as Nigel said, there's no aid going to go to the Soviet Union either if Barbarossa happens either on time or later. And you've got a consolidation of German power on the continent here, which is almost sort of not going to be overthrown.
So you don't think that Britain could almost live to fight another day and it might have been drawn back into the war later on? You think if we sue for peace in May 1940, that's it, we're out of the war?
And if we show any sense that we're going to come back into the war, Hitler will come at us with full power. There's no question about that. And I spent a lot of time looking at the German naval archives. The German Navy are fundamentally suspicious of Britain. And they want to actually bring them into the German system as soon as possible. They then want to project out into the world. And we've got to remember that Grand Admiral Raeder, who's head of the German Navy, he's an expert on what they call Handelskrieg, trade warfare. His big book that he writes after the end of the First World War, it's all about how you cripple trade and take it into your own ownership. And this is the template for what they want to do to Britain. They see the merchant marine, they see the colonies, and they say, that's us. And we shouldn't underestimate, I think, that is a very, very strong argument as to what would happen once the Germans had actually neutralised Britain.
Nigel, what about the role of the US? Do they ever get involved in the war in Europe, or do they purely focus on the Pacific? Does the Pacific War play out as it does?
I mean, the fascinating thing is the influence that Hitler and Germany would have had on Japan after a successful German conquest of Europe and a peace with Britain. Would they have been able to restrain Japan from attacking at Pearl Harbor or not? Because if history had played out as it actually did and the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor and drawn the US into a Pacific war with them, because we mustn't ever forget the only reason that the US fought a war with Germany was that a couple of days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States in solidarity with his Japanese ally. He didn't have to do that, but he did. He was foolish enough to do that. And as Chris said earlier, in the long term, Hitler realised he would have to eventually deal with the United States. Although he was primarily focused on Europe, he did regard the US as a potential rival for global supremacy, that he saw this. But I think we should always bear in mind that Hitler was not a rational man, that so much depended on his philosophy of permanent war. He saw, even if he had conquered the Soviet Union, he saw the future as German helots, German farmers ruling the Soviet Union as a colony, constantly fighting Russian guerrilla forces. He regarded that as a good thing. He regarded war, rather like Churchill, as actually an essential part of the human condition. And he welcomed the fact that there would be low power wars. And the point was that Germany should be the master, that Germany should win those wars.
I just wonder, Nigel, if once you've consolidated in Europe, as Germans, you say, well, we're going to have to take on the Soviet Union. We've really got to get the Japanese to fight the Soviet Union in the East at the same time. They spent all their time trying to stop an agreement between the United States and Japan right up till the end of the negotiations in 1941. They're very keen to keep the Japanese focused on the Soviet Union. There are three factions in Japan at the time. One wants to finish off China. That's the first thing. Another does want to fight the Soviet Union. The others want to go out into the Pacific, mainly led by the Navy, of course. So you've got this going on all the time. And I just wonder, what happens in the Pacific with the Japanese attacking the colonial empires of the South doesn't happen without what's happened in Europe. So there's this symbiotic relationship between the Pacific and Europe. If you change the dynamic in one, it changes the dynamic in the other. And I just wonder how it plays once the Germans have consolidated themselves here. And I do wonder whether the factions in Japan at the time would have gone for China / Soviet Union rather than...
And therefore the US never gets drawn into the war?
Well, we don't know, because we don't know the circumstances. Because remember, we've got to remember that the United States is heavily invested in preventing China being basically subdued and taken over by Japan. It's pursued this open trade policy with China for a long time through the 30s. It doesn't want a single power to dominate China, so its policy is there. So bizarrely, it could have been China that would have been the pretext for the United States being drawn across the Pacific. And we've got to remember that the Americans are looking to withdraw from the Philippines, for example, in 1946. That was always going to be the case. And so they were drawing their horns in a bit, but they were interested in China, regardless of what was happening with the colonial empires, as long as it didn't affect their investments and trade. There's another interesting issue in 1940 with the United States. If you read a lot of the political military literature at the time, what they see in Germany is this helot culture that Nigel was talking about. The Americans are very proud of saying, look, when we go into countries, we do it through trade and investment. Capitalist system, of course. When the Germans do it, it's complete domination. It's like domestic slavery, the way they want to operate. And you get this very interesting tinge through 1940 that the Germans are about enslaving people. It's not about actually taking over countries commercially. It's about this military and racial domination. And that's a very powerful thing. And by September 1941, for example, well before Pearl Harbor, 72% of Americans are saying we need to fight Germany. at some stage.
Is there a scenario then, Nigel, in which essentially after May, June 1940, the rest of the Second World War essentially becomes just a direct fight between the USSR and Nazi Germany?
Yes, I think that's the case. I do think, with all due respect to Chris, that there would have been a Barbarossa either on time, as he said, in June of 41, or a bit later, quite possibly. And I think the odds are that the Germans would have won Barbarossa, that they would have conquered Moscow, Leningrad.
So if Britain sues for peace in 1940, Barbarossa succeeds?
I think so.
If it takes place later. I have to stress, I'm not saying that Barbarossa doesn't happen.
You're saying later, yeah.
I think there's a window of vulnerability for the Soviet Union whereby it can be exploited. I think it happens later because, as I said, I think the Germans will want to consolidate by land and sea. They want to draw in their economic and commodity resources. Then they'll go for it. Now, the only thing is that actually the penny drops in the Soviet Union that this is about to happen. And then you might get the Soviet Union saying, well, we're standing up for this. I mean, I'm one of those people, and I've said it on here before, is that had the original plan for Barbarossa been put in place, it probably would have succeeded. But the minute you go for 3 army groups instead of 2 and a double envelopment, then it's always going to fail.
Isn't another important point we are vindicating the great man theory of history, because history at this point depended largely on the character, the will and the prejudices of 3 men, of Adolf Hitler, of Joseph Stalin, and I suppose of Franklin Roosevelt.
And Churchill.
And of course of Churchill, yes. But we're speculating what would have happened if Churchill had been out of the scene, either through death or whatever. And the warlords, if you like, as they used to be called, were crucially important. They even, in my view, trumped economic and strategic questions. I think everything depended on the ideas, the thoughts, the actions of 3 or 4 of these men.
So Hitler was right. It's about the power of the will.
I think so in this case.
Yeah.
Well, here's the really big question then. Britain sues for peace in May 1940. Does that lead to a Nazi victory in World War II?
Well, how do you define victory? As Nigel said earlier...
Victory in Europe?
Well, it certainly leads to victory and domination of Europe. You've got to share it with Italy to an extent, but Italy's facing south. There's no question about that. He's an ideological ally, but certainly in the areas you're interested in, which is the Nordic regions, here in the Balkans. I mean, this is the little issue that I have a concern about, is that if Germany is dominating the Balkans, basically the Slavic Soviet Union is saying, well, we have an interest here, and we're not really happy about you dominating these Slavic regions. So you're going to see tension, as you did during the First World War, of course, stoked up in this area here. But I think that the key question, if you get to this sort of situation, is that if Barbarossa or whenever it happens, does fail, who liberates Europe? That's the key question here. Who liberates Europe from the Nazis? If you can do it, it's going to be the Soviet Union. In those circumstances, will the United States basically use the Soviet Union as a proxy to be able to do that? And remember that the United States can supply Soviet Union at the other end, the Pacific end. It doesn't have to come through Europe. Yes. And I wonder if you do not see, as Germany consolidates power here, the United States saying to the Soviet Union, you and I have got a problem here, and it's Nazi Germany. And I think there's a real case for saying here that would have happened. And you end up in a situation where the United States is putting pressure on the Atlantic and any trade that the Germans are doing, as we would have done, of course, in terms of blockade. And I think the United States industry would have been geared up to actually getting the Soviet Union as a proxy force to deal with Germany. So
in a sense, Nigel, that is not dissimilar to what ends up happening. You get the Soviets coming from the east and you get only the US in this scenario coming from the west.
But I don't think you get a Western Front here.
Okay.
In here. That's the
Just
point.
pressure in the Atlantic.
I think you strangle as much as you can. It's what Britain did, if you remember, during the Napoleonic War. There was a continental system,
yes,
which Napoleon sought to enforce, and the Britain said, we're not having that. And we imposed a very close blockade on the continental system. So I think the Americans, but remember, the Americans in 1940 go for a two-ocean navy policy. They realise they can't switch their one ocean navy through the Panama Canal back and forth and be in two places at the same time. So they're heading for this two-ocean navy. And I think you're going to see the American Navy really built up in response to this. They'll want to push across the Atlantic, strangle German, well, not German, but this continental system. But at the same time, diplomacy is saying to the Soviet Union, they're coming for you next. We'll help you. You're going to need a friend.
Nigel, clearly Britain dropping out of the war in
Yes.
May or June of 1940 helps Nazi Germany. Does it help them win the war?
I think it definitely does. Certainly the limited war that we've been talking about, though not possibly the future global war between the power blocks that we've also been talking about. But in terms of the war in Europe and Churchill's fight them on the beaches, none of that would have happened, and we would have made this rather shamefaced peace with Nazi Germany, which would have left us strategically at a great disadvantage.
Well,
anyway.
yes. How does the world view Britain?
Well, the colonies, for a start,
Yeah.
will
Yes,
say, mother
yeah.
country, can't have
Exactly.
any faith in them.
Definitely.
I mean, Nigel's earlier point about the United States wanting self-determination instead of empires in the world. I mean, this is part of actual Nazi propaganda as well. They want to give India, Thailand, and all these other countries their independence, so they can dominate them.
Yes.
But they're talking all the time in propaganda as why has Britain got this empire? They need to have their independence. So from a sort of virtuous point of view, the Americans are saying it. From a coercive point of view, the Germans are saying it. So there's this general, I think the British Empire, apart from the Dominions, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, would all have fallen apart.
But Britain's sense of itself as well gets absolutely shattered, because the 20th century, you could argue, is a century of British decline. I mean, it is really a century of British decline, and yet it's punctuated halfway through by Britain standing alone against the greatest evil the world has ever known, and in this scenario, that doesn't happen.
Exactly, yes. And so that myth of Britain, as if you like, as the world policeman defending democracy, would have been completely busted, would never have taken place, in fact. So I think that it would have been, although temporarily an advantage, we wouldn't have had the Blitz, we wouldn't have had anyone dying in the war. In the long term, a peace with Germany in 1940 would have been a disaster for Britain and for the world.
I think an interesting way of looking at this is what happened to France. France was actually defeated, but its colonies were unsustainable after the war.
Yes.
And a lot of the rhetoric around that was how much prestige it had lost by actually losing to Germany again.
Yes.
And so in some ways, what happened to France and attitudes about itself would be reflected, I think, in Britain.
De Gaulle would never have been heard of. The Free French would never have been
That's
heard
right.
of, because they were totally dependent on British support to get going.
And so, but also this sense of national self-worth and assertiveness, I think, probably would have been lost in the same way that France did. Not quite the same, because France were defeated on the field of battle, but frankly, coming to terms is like a surrender anyway. That's the point. But I think my major worry, if I'd have been a Brit then, is the extent to which, as I said, I think we'd have been isolated and everything we did would have been controlled, essentially, despite the fleet.
And what does it mean for fascism? I mean, does the fascism that we saw in Europe in the 1930s and the 1940s continue much later on into the 20th century? OK, you had Franco in Spain until the 70s, but would you have seen fascism dominating much of Europe into the latter part of the 20th century in the same way you had communism?
Yes, I think so on that as well. And also, one thing we haven't mentioned is the huge support that pseudo-fascism had in the United States.
Yes.
In Lindbergh and the original America First Committee. Charles Lindbergh, this world-famous aviator, a world star and celebrity, headed up this isolationist, pro-German, pro-Nazi. He was hugely impressed by his visits to Germany. He was a racist, white supremacist anyway, and he thought that Germany was unconquerable. They showed him the Luftwaffe and planes, and he believed that. And he had enormous influence in America. And there is a scenario that he could well have stood against Roosevelt in one of the later elections that Roosevelt won, and won on a neo-fascist, essentially white supremacist programme.
Yep.
Chris, you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key point about fascism is unless you invade the countries where they're based, you're not going to get rid of it.
Yeah.
I mean, the real lesson, even today, if you want to get rid of a regime that is underpinned by an ideology, you actually have to invade where it's based. You can't just get rid of it. And that's the point. Unless you can get on the continent of Europe again, you've got fascist regimes, obviously home-based here. And people generally, just like with communism, will follow the mood music.
Put up with it.
Yeah, they'll put up with it because actually it's a coercive regime that will do nasty things to you if you step out of line. But also, if you want the goodies from the regime, you'll also do that as well. I mean, I've done some recent research into why people join the SS, for example. Well, it was considered to be an elite organisation, and frankly, it enabled you to have the goodies.
Yeah.
If you had a Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, you didn't have to queue in sort of shops and things like that. You had all sorts of privileges associated with transport and with accommodation and things like that. And so people generally who are benefiting from the system will support it. It's only when you stop benefiting that you get the sort of people who want to dissent and rebel. But given the coercive regimes that exist in fascist sort of polities and also in communist ones as well, unless you invade, you're never, ever going to knock them out. The security system is too tight.
And treading on very delicate grounds here, would the Holocaust have happened, or would Germany, being master of that, would they have deported the Jewish population of Europe to Palestine? I mean, they did. Adolf Eichmann visited Palestine, which of course was ruled by a British mandate given by the League of Nations, to search out whether that would make a suitable home for Germany's exiled Jews. Would that have happened? Because the Holocaust really got going when Germany was up against the war, was fighting the war.
I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, the Holocaust seems to get accelerated by the fact that the United States enters the war. Because it's part, as we spoke, Nigel, of the racial ideology of Hitler. He talks about it all the time, is if the Jews provoke a world war, then they'll be annihilated.
Yes.
And to me, that's the accelerant, Nigel. It's almost the excuse to actually get on with it. And the Wannsee Conference follows on from that. And you switch from emigration to annihilation at that point. And I've never worked out in my mind whether that's an excuse or it's the logical extension of what Hitler says in Mein Kampf in the second book. I think it's a logical extension. It seems to come out very quickly once the United States enters the war. It's part of a Jewish global conspiracy. Yes. America is the home of Jewish finance, Jewish influence, all that sort of thing. He always talks about Roosevelt being completely dominated by Jewish thinking. And so that's the accelerant in my mind. But reading in the literature of the times, I have no doubt that the whole migration issue was too difficult organisationally, so they moved to, I'm afraid, extermination very quickly. And of course, we saw the results.
Well, Jens, listen, as ever, this has been absolutely fascinating. I think we can certainly say that there were very active discussions at the heart of the British government in May 1940 about whether Britain should sue for peace. And had that happened, the rest of the Second World War would have almost certainly looked completely different. It would have emboldened Hitler and his Nazi regime. It would have left Nazi domination of continental Europe. Does Operation Barbarossa happen? When it does, in the summer of 1941? Quite possibly not, so maybe it gets delayed. And does that make it more likely that Operation Barbarossa succeeds? What then happens to the Soviet Union? Does the US ever get drawn into World War II, either in Europe or even in the Pacific at all? And then as a result, what does the rest of the 20th century look like? Do you get fascism spreading across Europe? cementing its status in Europe in the same way that communism spread across much of Eastern Europe in the latter part of the 20th century? And how is Britain seen in the world, having sued for peace with Adolf Hitler? The British Empire almost certainly collapses, as indeed it would go on to do anyway, but Britain's sense of itself would surely be very, very different today. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Nigel Jones for joining me. And of course, thank you to our sponsors. Visit Malta. Remember, if you want to find out how you can explore more wonder and learn about Malta's rich history and culture, head to visitmalta.com. And we'll be back undoing more history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. And don't forget, you can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.